The sun beat down on Harmony Creek with an unforgiving intensity, baking the parched earth into a cracked mosaic that stretched to the horizon. A fine, red dust, churned by the hooves of cattle and the occasional creaking wagon, perpetually coated everything: the weathered storefronts, the skeletal windmills, and the hopeful, yet weary, faces of its inhabitants. It was a town perched precariously on the very edge of civilization, a testament to human resilience and a magnet for those seeking a new beginning or a convenient place to disappear. Yet, for all its ruggedness, Harmony Creek was about to witness a quiet revolution, one carried in the heart of a young woman who stepped off the stagecoach, her calico dress a beacon of gentle defiance against the harsh landscape. Her name was Alara Vance, and she carried not a six-shooter, but a worn leather satchel filled with books, chalk, and dreams of enlightenment. Her arrival was met with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism from the townsfolk, who were more accustomed to the clatter of spurs than the rustle of academic texts. Alara possessed an inner strength that belied her refined appearance, a resolve forged in the bustling, structured world she had left behind for the raw, untamed promise of the West. She had come to Harmony Creek to establish its first school, a sanctuary of learning amidst the grit and grime, a place where the children of ranchers, prospectors, and even the occasional reformed drifter could find a path beyond the endless dusty plains. Her mission, though seemingly simple, was profound: to cultivate minds in a land where survival often overshadowed scholarship, to plant seeds of knowledge in a soil accustomed only to struggle. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but Alara Vance was not one to shy away from a challenge, especially when it came to igniting the flame of curiosity in young hearts. She was a woman of unwavering conviction, her spirit as unyielding as the ancient mesas that guarded Harmony Creek, her gaze as clear and expansive as the boundless skies above. The very air in Harmony Creek vibrated with the untamed spirit of the frontier, a wild symphony of creaking leather, distant coyote howls, and the intermittent, jarring clang of a blacksmith's hammer. The town was a patchwork of rough-hewn timber and sun-baked adobe, its buildings leaning together like conspirators sharing secrets against the vast, indifferent desert. The dusty main street, more a wide track than a thoroughfare, was the pulsing artery of Harmony Creek, alive with the slow, deliberate movements of horses and the purposeful strides of men whose lives were etched into their weathered faces. Saloons, their doors perpetually ajar, spilled forth the boisterous sounds of tinny piano music and raucous laughter, mingling with the scent of stale beer and cheap whiskey. General stores, their shelves crammed with everything from mining picks to embroidered bonnets, offered a semblance of domesticity, while the livery stable, perpetually shrouded in the smell of hay and horseflesh, served as the town's vital link to the outside world. Harmony Creek was a paradox, a fragile outpost of humanity clinging to the edge of an immense wilderness, yet imbued with an indomitable spirit that defied its isolation. It was a town where reputations were forged and broken in the blink of an eye, where a man's word was his bond, and where the stark realities of life and death were constant companions. The unforgiving landscape shaped not only the physical appearance of the town but also the character of its inhabitants, instilling in them a rugged individualism and a deep-seated suspicion of outsiders, a skepticism Alara would soon learn to navigate. As Alara stepped down from the stagecoach, her refined Eastern sensibilities were immediately assaulted by the raw, visceral reality of the West. The air was thick with the scent of horse manure, dry earth, and something indefinable yet distinctly wild. The sun, a brutal orb in the azure sky, glared down, making her squint. She adjusted the brim of her bonnet, a small, almost defiant gesture against the sheer scale of the landscape. Her gaze swept across the dusty main street, taking in the rough-hewn structures, the grizzled faces, and the children playing in the dirt, their laughter surprisingly carefree despite their surroundings. It was a world utterly alien to the manicured lawns and genteel parlors she had known, a place where survival was etched into every furrowed brow and calloused hand. A group of men, leaning against the hitching post outside the saloon, paused their conversation to openly appraise her, their stares a mixture of curiosity and something akin to a challenge. Alara felt a prickle of unease, but she met their gazes with a quiet dignity, refusing to be intimidated. She knew that to falter now would be to lose ground, to concede to the harshness before she had even begun. This was her new home, her new purpose, and she would face it with the same unwavering spirit that had brought her all this way. The journey had been long and arduous, a winding ribbon of discomfort and anticipation that had stretched for weeks across the vast expanse of the continent. But with each bump and jolt of the stagecoach, her resolve had only hardened, her conviction in her mission growing stronger. As she gathered her modest belongings, a figure emerged from the shadows of the general store, tall and lean, with the easy grace of a man accustomed to riding long distances. He wore a faded denim shirt, chaps, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his eyes in shadow, but Alara could discern a powerful build beneath his practical attire. He moved with an economical efficiency, his spurs jingling a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the distant lowing of cattle. This was Clay Callahan, a ranch hand known throughout Harmony Creek for his quiet strength and an almost primal connection to the land. He was a man of few words, preferring the company of horses and the solitude of the open range to the idle chatter of the saloon. Yet, beneath his rugged exterior lay a keen mind and a deep-seated sense of justice, qualities that were often overlooked by those who judged him only by his weathered hands and sun-darkened skin. Clay was an enigma, a man forged from the very dust of the West, his spirit as untamed as the wild horses he occasionally wrangled. His family had been among the first settlers in the region, carving out a difficult existence from the unforgiving terrain, and he carried their legacy with a quiet pride. He embodied the fierce independence and resilient spirit of the frontier, a man who knew the land intimately, reading its subtle signs with an instinct born of generations. Clay had been sent by Sheriff Brody to meet the new schoolteacher, a task he'd accepted with his usual stoic indifference. He watched Alara with an almost imperceptible flicker of interest, an unusual emotion for a man who rarely showed more than a placid calm. There was something about her, the way she carried herself, the quiet determination in her eyes, that set her apart from the other women who occasionally passed through Harmony Creek. She was an unexpected splash of color in a world of muted browns and grays, a delicate flower daring to bloom in the unyielding desert. He approached her, his spurs making a soft metallic chime on the dusty ground, and removed his hat, revealing a tangle of sun-streaked brown hair and eyes the color of a stormy sky. "Miss Vance?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, surprisingly gentle for a man of his imposing stature. "I'm Clay Callahan. Sheriff Brody sent me to help you settle in." His gaze, though brief, held a spark of something Alara couldn't quite decipher, a flicker of respect, perhaps, or a nascent curiosity that mirrored her own. She felt an odd tremor, a nervous flutter in her chest that she quickly dismissed as fatigue from her journey. But as their eyes met, a silent current passed between them, a fleeting connection forged in the dust and heat of Harmony Creek, a precursor to the trials that lay ahead. This seemingly ordinary encounter, under the vast, indifferent gaze of the western sky, marked the beginning of something extraordinary, a story waiting to the walk to the old homestead that would serve as Alara's schoolhouse and living quarters was a journey through the heart of Harmony Creek. Clay Callahan led the way, his long, unhurried strides eating up the dusty ground, while Alara trailed behind, her small canvas satchel feeling surprisingly heavy on her shoulder. The town's curious stares followed them, a palpable weight that made her self-conscious. She was an oddity, a piece of delicate porcelain in a world of rough-hewn granite, and she could feel the unspoken judgments of the locals with every step. Her resolve, which had felt so unshakable moments ago, began to waver under the collective gaze of a community that seemed to prize brawn over books. Yet, Clay remained a silent, steady presence beside her, a bulwark against the tide of silent scrutiny. He didn't offer empty reassurances or try to fill the quiet with small talk, an action Alara found surprisingly comforting. Instead, he simply walked, his gaze fixed on the path ahead, as if their destination was the only thing that mattered. His silence was a form of communication in itself, a quiet acknowledgment of her presence, and a promise of protection without ever having to utter a word. The homestead, a small adobe structure on the outskirts of town, was more dilapidated than she had imagined from the description in the letter. The roof sagged in the middle like a weary smile, the windows were boarded up, and a thick layer of dust coated every surface, both inside and out. A lone, wind-whipped mesquite tree stood guard beside it, its gnarled branches reaching for a sky that offered no rain. A deep sigh escaped Alara's lips, a tiny, almost inaudible sound of disappointment that Clay, with his acute senses honed by years on the range, immediately caught. He stopped and turned, his dark eyes taking in the same scene, but with a different understanding. To him, the house was just a house, a structure in need of repair, nothing more. He hadn't seen the grand vision Alara had painted in her mind, the image of a place bustling with the energy of learning and the hope of a brighter future. He saw only the raw, physical work that needed to be done. Without a word, he set down her luggage, and with a grunt of effort, began to pry one of the heavy wooden boards from the main window. His movements were fluid and powerful, the very embodiment of a man at home in this rugged world. He was a force of nature, a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of an unforgiving landscape, and watching him work, Ilara felt a different kind of awe, not for the grandeur of the West, but for the quiet dignity of a man who belonged to it. As Clay worked, the late afternoon sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the landscape, turning the familiar ochre of the desert into a canvas of deep gold and bruised purple. Ilara, feeling more useless than she cared to admit, busied herself by unlatching the rusted gate and pushing it open with a groan of metal against metal. The air hung heavy with the scent of dry earth and sagebrush, a fragrance as untamed as the land itself. She imagined the scent of ink and old paper that would one day replace it, a small dream that felt impossibly far away. Clay, having successfully removed the board, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He gestured to the open window. Dust storm last winter. Had to board it up to keep the place from filling with sand. Sheriff said he'd have it cleaned, but, well, he's a busy man. His words were clipped, to the point, and offered no apology for the state of the building. It was a simple statement of fact, a truth of life on the frontier. Ilara nodded, a slow realization dawning on her. She hadn't just moved to a new town, she had moved to a new world with its own set of rules and expectations, and she was woefully unprepared. She was a scholar, not a pioneer, and the reality of her situation hit her with the force of a physical blow. The books in her satchel suddenly felt less like tools of enlightenment and more like a heavy burden. She felt a sting of tears behind her eyes, a sharp, unwelcome wave of frustration and homesickness. Clay, ever observant, noticed the subtle change in her posture, the slight slump of her shoulders, and the way her lower lip trembled almost imperceptibly. He paused his work, his gaze softening. He wasn't a man given to grand gestures, but he knew what it was to feel overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the frontier. He had seen strong men break under its weight, and something about this delicate, bookish woman stirred a protective instinct within him he hadn't known he possessed. "It ain't much, but it's a start," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "We'll get it cleaned up. Give me a day or two, and I'll have the kids help." The simple, genuine offer of help, without a hint of judgment or condescension, was a lifeline she hadn't known she needed. It was an act of pure, unadulterated kindness in a world she had perceived as harsh and unforgiving. She looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time, at the sun-crinkled lines around his eyes, the faint scar that ran along his jaw, and the way his hands, though rough and powerful, held an unexpected gentleness. In that moment, the silent cowboy from the dusty streets of Harmony Creek transformed from a stranger into a surprising ally. He represented a different kind of strength, one she hadn't known existed outside of her books, the strength of a man who didn't fight the land, but worked with it, a silent sentinel who understood the quiet language of perseverance. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a fiery farewell, Ilara felt a new kind of hope flicker within her. She was not alone in this untamed wilderness. But as she watched Clay walk away, a solitary figure disappearing into the twilight, a sense of foreboding settled in her heart. She didn't know it yet, but the same rugged kindness that had won her over was about to make him a target. A storm was brewing on the horizon, one not of sand and wind, but of greed and violence, and it was heading straight for Harmony Creek, and for the man who had dared to show a stranger a simple act of human decency. Unfold in a land as unpredictable as the human heart. The next morning dawned with the quiet hum of a town preparing for a new day. But for Ilara, it was a day of monumental work. She found Clay waiting for her at the homestead, not with an imposing presence, but with a quiet efficiency that spoke volumes. He had already brought a bucket and a broom, his own contribution to her daunting task. Together, they began to clear out the dust and debris that had accumulated over years of neglect. The quiet strength of his hands as they handled a hammer or a heavy plank. He was a man of the earth, and in his presence, Ilara felt a surprising sense of security, a feeling she had not expected to find in this wild, unpredictable land. As the morning wore on, a small procession of children, coaxed and prodded by their parents, began to arrive. They stood at a distance, their young faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, their eyes wide with wonder at the sight of the strange woman with the books. Clay simply nodded to them, a gesture of quiet encouragement, and one by one, they tentatively approached. A small, wiry boy named Billy was the first, clutching a homemade book of slate and charcoal in his hand. "My pa says you're here to teach us," he said, his voice a whisper, as if speaking of a great secret. Ilara smiled, a genuine, heart-warming expression that seemed to chase away some of the dust and gloom. She knelt to their level, her calico dress brushing against the dry earth, and spoke to them not as a teacher to her students, but as a friend to her new companions. She didn't talk about history or arithmetic. She told them a story, a fantastical tale of a brave knight and a fire-breathing dragon, using a piece of chalk to draw the scene on the side of the adobe wall. The children, captivated, sat in a circle around her, their initial fear melting away, replaced by the rapt attention of newfound discovery. Clay watched from a distance, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He had seen her strength the day before, but this was a different kind, a power born not of force, but of kindness and imagination. He had a sudden, profound realization. This schoolhouse, once just an empty shell, was about to become a place of magic. The peaceful scene was shattered by a low, guttural rumble that echoed across the plains, not the sound of thunder, but something far more menacing. The children instinctively huddled closer to Alara, their laughter gone. Clay's posture changed instantly, his easy demeanor replaced by an alert tension. His hand went to the worn grip of the pistol on his hip, a silent, instinctual motion. From the dusty horizon, a cloud of red dust rose like a harbinger of doom, followed by the sight of a dozen riders, their silhouettes dark and menacing against the brilliant sky. They rode with an aggressive confidence, their faces obscured by bandanas, their eyes glinting with a cold, predatory light. The lead rider, a hulking man on a monstrous black stallion, wore a long, distinctive rattlesnake skin coiled around the brim of his hat. He was known throughout the territory as Rattler, the ruthless leader of a gang infamous for their brutality and their thirst for blood. They were a plague on the frontier, hitting small towns and isolated ranches with a terrifying speed and efficiency, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. They were the very antithesis of everything Alara was trying to build, a force of chaos and destruction in a land that so desperately craved order. Rattler and his gang rode into Harmony Creek like a force of nature, their horses kicking up a choking storm of dust. The town, which had been bustling moments before, went utterly silent. Store owners pulled down their shades, and the few townsfolk on the street ducked into doorways. The gang pulled up in front of the saloon, their spurs jingling with a sinister chime. Rattler dismounted, his movements a brutal caricature of Clay's fluid grace. He was a mountain of a man, his face a road map of old scars, and his eyes held a cruel intelligence that was far more dangerous than simple savagery. He scanned the town, a sneer twisting his lips as if he found its very existence an insult. His gaze finally settled on the small adobe building where Ilara and the children were huddled together, and on the tall figure of Clay Callahan standing protectively in front of them, his hand still on his pistol. The corner of Rattler's mouth lifted into a slow, mocking smile. He had found what he was looking for, not just a town to raid, but a defiance to crush. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, as the two men locked eyes across the dusty main street. It was a silent challenge, an unspoken test of wills, and in that moment, Ilara realized that the peace of Harmony Creek was not just threatened, it was already shattered. The true fight for this town, and for its soul, was about to begin, and Clay Callahan, her unexpected protector, was standing directly in the path of the coming storm. The air in Harmony Creek was thick with an unbearable tension, a suffocating blanket woven from fear and the choking dust stirred by the rattlesnake gang's horses. The children, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, instinctively pressed closer to Ilara, their small hands clutching at her skirt. Their wide, innocent eyes darted between the menacing figures on horseback and Clay Callahan, who stood as still and unyielding as a statue, his silhouette sharp against the midday sun. Ilara felt a chill, not from the desert air, but from the cold, calculating gaze of Rattler, which seemed to pierce right through her. His presence radiated a raw, untamed savagery that made her blood run cold, a stark contrast to the quiet strength of Clay. She suddenly understood the true meaning of fear, a primal instinct that threatened to paralyze her. Yet, even in the face of such overwhelming menace, she refused to cower. She was a teacher, a protector, and she would not let these men terrorize her innocent students. Rattler dismounted with a heavy thud, his spurs jingling like a death knell. He took a slow, deliberate walk towards Clay, his eyes never leaving the ranch hand's face. Each step was a challenge, a test of will, and the silence that followed was punctuated only by the nervous shifting of the gang's horses and the distant, mournful cry of a hawk circling high above. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Rattler's voice was a low growl, rough as sandpaper and filled with a mocking derision. "Looks like Harmony Creek's got itself a new sheriff, or maybe just a dog who thinks he can bark. A few of his gang members chuckled, their laughter harsh and unsettling, like the scraping of dry bones. Rattler stopped a mere 10 feet from Clay, his immense shadow falling over the smaller man. "You got something to say, cowboy? Or are you just gonna stand there staring like a dumb mule?" His hand hovered near the butt of his own formidable revolver, a silent but potent threat. Clay, however, remained impassive, his expression unreadable. His hand remained firmly on the grip of his pistol, a silent promise of resistance. "This ain't your territory, Rattler," he said, his voice low and steady, a calm in the heart of the storm. "Harmony Creek's a peaceful town. We don't want trouble." His words were not a plea, but a statement of fact, a declaration of intent. Rattler's sneer widened, revealing a flash of yellowed teeth. "Peaceful, huh? Funny, I see a place ripe for the pickin'. And as for territory, cowboy, wherever my boots touch the ground, that's my territory." He glanced past Clay at Alara and the children, a cruel glint in his eyes. "And what's this? A schoolmarm and her little lambs? Looks like you got quite the flock to protect, shepherd." The implication was clear. Rattler saw their vulnerability, and he intended to exploit it. Alara felt a surge of cold fury, quickly followed by a wave of terror. She knew, with a horrifying certainty, that these men would not hesitate to inflict pain, to destroy everything she and Clay were trying to build. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, a fierce resolve hardened her spine. She had faced down skepticism and prejudice. She would not let brute force break her spirit. She stepped forward, pushing the children gently behind her. "We are not lambs to be slaughtered, Mr. Rattler," she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "And these children deserve a future, not fear." Her unexpected defiance seemed to momentarily surprise Rattler, a flicker of something akin to curiosity in his eyes before it was quickly replaced by a dark amusement. Clay, however, shot her a quick, warning glance, a silent plea for caution. He knew the depths of this man's depravity, and he didn't want Alara to become a target. Rattler laughed, a harsh, grating sound that grated on Alara's nerves. "Well, listen to the little songbird sing. Feisty, ain't ya? I like feisty." He took another step closer, his eyes fixed on Alara, a possessive glint now mixed with the cruelty. "Tell you what, schoolmarm. I'll make you a deal. You and your flock can keep your future, if you tell your cowboy friend here to step aside. Let us have our fun, and nobody gets hurt." His gaze shifted back to Clay, a silent challenge in his eyes. He was not just testing Clay's courage, but his loyalty, his willingness to sacrifice for those he protected. The tension in the air became almost unbearable, thick enough to choke on. The children watched, their faces pale with terror, understanding instinctively that their fate hung in the balance. Clay's face remained a mask, but Alara could see the slight tightening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible clench of his hand on his pistol. He was caught between a rock and a hard place, forced to choose between the immediate safety of the town and his own principles. The silence that followed was punctuated only by the whirring of a lone tumbleweed skipping across the dusty street. Every eye in Harmony Creek was fixed on Clay Callahan, the fate of their town resting squarely on his shoulders. He was a man of the frontier, accustomed to making difficult choices, but this one felt different, heavier. His gaze moved from Rattler's sneering face to Alara's pale, determined one, then to the terrified faces of the children huddled behind her. He knew what Rattler was capable of, the senseless violence, the wanton destruction. He knew that any resistance would be met with overwhelming force. But he also knew that to surrender now would be to surrender everything: their dignity, their hope, their very right to exist peacefully. His hand, still on the butt of his pistol, tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ain't no deal to be made, Rattler," Clay finally said, his voice resonating with an unexpected authority that cut through the silence like a gunshot. "Harmony Creek ain't for sale, and these folks ain't movin'." Rattler's grin vanished, replaced by a cold, deadly glint in his eyes. "Fool," he hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You just sealed your own fate." Before anyone could react, Rattler's hand moved with lightning speed, drawing his monstrous revolver. The metallic click echoed like thunder in the stillness, and the muzzle of his gun was aimed directly at Clay's chest. The air crackled with raw, untamed danger. Alara gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a deadly game, and Clay had just thrown down the gauntlet. The fate of Harmony Creek, and the lives of everyone in it, hung by a single fragile thread. The standoff had begun, a deadly dance on the dusty stage of the Wild West, and no one knew who would be left standing when the music stopped. The world seemed to shrink to a single point of terrible focus, the cold, black eye of Rattler's revolver, aimed squarely at Clay Callahan's chest. For a moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure terror. The children behind her were silent, their small, terrified faces a stark portrait of fear. They understood, with the innate clarity of children who had grown up on the edge of the world, that this was not a game. This was death, plain and simple, staring them down in the middle of their dusty street. Rattler's finger tightened on the trigger, a predatory smile once more twisting his lips. He was savoring this moment, the absolute power of life and death, the ultimate expression of his brutal dominance. He had faced down countless lawmen and defiant ranchers, and in the end, they all broke. He expected Clay to break, to flinch, to beg for his life. But Clay's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, remained calm and steady, unflinching in the face of the ultimate threat. He was a rock against the storm, a man who had made his peace with the land and with himself, and who had nothing left to prove. Clay's mind, however, was a whirlwind of calculations, a flurry of decisions made in the blink of an eye. He wasn't a gunslinger, he was a ranch hand. His skill was with a lasso and a rifle, not with a quick-draw duel in the middle of town. He knew he couldn't outdraw a man like Rattler, a man whose entire life was a testament to violence. But he also knew Rattler was arrogant, confident in his own speed. That was his weakness. Clay's gaze flickered to the side, to the dry, packed earth beside Rattler's boots, and a dangerous idea sparked in his mind. He would not face Rattler head-on. He would use the one thing the outlaw didn't expect, a different kind of fight. A fight for survival, not for glory. He wasn't interested in proving he was the fastest gun. He was only interested in protecting his town and the people in it. He took a single, barely perceptible step back, a movement so subtle it was almost invisible, and his hand tightened on the butt of his pistol, not in preparation for a draw, but for something else entirely. He was betting everything on one desperate, brilliant move, a move that only a man who understood the land and the way things worked on the frontier would ever dare to attempt. Rattler's voice cut through the silence, a low, triumphant hiss. "I told you, cowboy. You just sealed your fate." He cocked the hammer of his revolver, the metallic click a sound that reverberated through the silent street. But before his finger could squeeze the trigger, Clay's hand moved. It wasn't the blur of a quick draw, it was a deliberate, almost graceful arc. He didn't pull his gun from its holster. Instead, with a powerful, practiced motion, he used the grip of his pistol to flip a handful of the fine, red dust from the ground directly into Rattler's eyes. The effect was immediate and devastating. Rattler roared in pain and surprise, his gun arm flailing wildly as he was momentarily blinded. In that fraction of a second, Clay drew his weapon. He didn't aim for Rattler's heart, as a killer would, but for his weapon. The single gunshot was deafening, the report echoing off the storefronts and startling the horses. Rattler's pistol, now knocked from his grip by the force of the bullet, clattered harmlessly into the dust. The gang, stunned by the unexpected turn of events, hesitated. They had expected to see their leader make quick work of the ranch hand. They hadn't expected to see him blinded by dirt, his gun on the ground. Rattler, shaking his head and blinking furiously, wiped the dust from his eyes with a curse. He saw Clay, his pistol now leveled at his chest, his expression no longer calm, but hard as flint. The outlaw's face twisted in a mask of pure rage and humiliation. He was a man who lived and died by his reputation, and in front of his gang and an entire town, that reputation had been sullied by a simple trick. He knew he was beaten for the moment. The element of surprise was gone, and the townspeople, having seen his vulnerability, would be emboldened. With a final furious glare, he spat a stream of obscenities, grabbed his pistol from the dust, and mounted his horse. "You hear me, cowboy," he snarled, his voice thick with unbridled hatred. "This ain't over. I'll be back, and when I do, I'll burn this town to the ground with you and your schoolmarm in it." With a brutal kick to his stallion's ribs, he wheeled his horse around and, with the rest of his gang following closely behind, rode away in a thundering cloud of red dust, their retreat a bitter testament to their defeat. The silence that returned to Harmony Creek was different from the one that had come before. This was a silence of shock and relief, followed by a sudden, collective exhalation of breath. The townspeople emerged from their hiding places, their eyes filled with a new-found awe for the ranch hand who had stared down a legend and won. Ilara, her legs weak with relief, ran to Clay, her hands grasping his arm, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and admiration. He was a far more complex man than she had ever imagined, a hero not of myth and legend, but of quiet cunning and unshakable principle. But Rattler's words hung in the air like a poisonous fog, a promise of a future filled with violence and retribution. He had not been defeated. He had only been delayed. And now, he had a reason to return, not just for plunder, but for revenge, and he knew exactly who he was coming for. As Ilara looked at Clay, at the quiet strength in his eyes and the determination in his face, she knew that their love story had just begun, but it was already written in the language of fire and gunpowder, with a deadly deadline. The calm had been a mirage, and the storm was coming. They had just bought themselves some time, but at what cost? And would they be ready when the rattlesnake came for them again? The stakes have been raised. The gunfight is over, but the conflict is far from finished. The personal vendetta between Rattler and Clay is now the central motivation for the rest of the epic. The jubilation was short-lived. The cheers and claps that had greeted Clay's improbable victory over Rattler faded as the reality of the gang leader's final words settled in. The dust from the horses had barely settled, yet a new kind of quiet had fallen over Harmony Creek, one of grim determination. The townsfolk who had just moments before been cowering in doorways now emerged, their faces a mixture of awe and dawning dread. They knew that Rattler's threat was not an idle one. He was a man of his word when it came to vengeance, and he was coming back. This time, he would not be so easily fooled. He would come not just to rob, but to destroy. The town was no longer a symbol of peaceful resilience. It was a declared battlefield, and the battle was only a matter of time. Ilara stood beside Clay, her hand still on his arm, the warmth of his skin a stark contrast to the cold fear coiling in her stomach. She looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time as the protector he had revealed himself to be. She saw the quiet strength that had allowed him to stand firm against a monster. She saw the cleverness that had given him the edge. Her heart, which had been aflutter with the budding romance of their initial meetings, now swelled with a deep and profound love, forged in the crucible of shared terror. But with that love came a new, terrifying burden. She was now deeply, irrevocably tied to a man who had made a powerful, dangerous enemy. He was no longer just Clay, the quiet ranch hand. He was the town's hero and a target. The life she had planned, a quiet existence of teaching children, had been shattered. Now, her life, and the life of everyone in Harmony Creek, depended on whether a handful of ranchers and shopkeepers could transform into an army. The rest of the day was a blur of frantic activity. The town gathered at the saloon, now a makeshift town hall, the scent of spilled whiskey mixing with the scent of fear. Sheriff Brody, a portly man whose job had been mostly limited to breaking up drunken brawls, looked out of his depth. He paced back and forth, wringing his hands, his face pale with worry. "He's gonna come back," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "He's gonna bring twice the men, and they'll be mad as hornets." The townspeople fell into a panicked debate, a cacophony of proposed solutions. Some argued they should pack up and leave. Others suggested they send out a plea for help to the nearest cavalry outpost, a mission that would take weeks, if it was successful at all. But a young rancher, fresh-faced and full of righteous anger, stood and spoke what was on everyone's mind. "We can't run. This is our home. We stand and fight." His words resonated with the town, a flicker of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. Every eye in the room turned to Clay Callahan, not for a solution, but for a leader. He was no lawman or military strategist, but he was the one who had faced the demon and not flinched. The weight of their expectations settled on his shoulders, a burden far heavier than any he had ever carried on the range. Clay stepped forward, his expression grave. He looked at the faces in the room, the tired eyes of the blacksmith, the wrinkled face of the general store owner, the fierce determination of the mothers holding their children. He saw his own future in their faces, and he knew he could not abandon them. "We can't outrun them, and we can't outgun them," he said, his voice low and clear, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. But we know this land better than they do. We'll fortify the town, barricade the streets, turn the saloons into strongholds. We'll fight smart, not hard. The plan, though desperate, was the only one they had. The town would become a fortress, and its people would become soldiers. The rest of the afternoon was spent in a feverish frenzy of preparation. The sound of hammering and sawing replaced the usual clatter of horseshoes and the lazy hum of conversation. The schoolhouse, the very symbol of Ilara's peaceful mission, was transformed into a command post, its windows boarded up and its doors fortified. As night fell, Ilara stood with Clay on the outskirts of town, the silhouettes of the townspeople working in the moonlight a testament to their newfound purpose. The desert wind, which had once felt wild and free, now felt like a mournful sigh. "It's all my fault," she whispered, the guilt a heavy weight on her soul. "If I hadn't come here, if you hadn't helped me." Clay turned to her, his hand gently touching her cheek. "No," he said, his voice firm. "Rattler would have come eventually. It was just a matter of time. You just gave us a reason to fight back instead of just bending over." His words, though simple, were a profound comfort. But even as they stood together, their hands finding each other in the darkness, a sense of foreboding hung in the air. This was just the beginning. The sun would rise again on Harmony Creek, but it would be a different town, a town bracing for war. They were a flock of lambs, learning to be wolves, but would they be ready when the rattlesnake came for them? And would their newfound love be strong enough to survive the coming fire? The initial frenzy of preparation had long since given way to a quiet, unsettling routine. The sun, which had once felt like a benevolent guardian, now seemed to mock their efforts, a silent countdown to the coming storm. Weeks had passed since Rattler's vengeful threat, and Harmony Creek had been transformed. Barricades of lumber and upturned wagons now lined the main street, turning the once-open thoroughfare into a fortified gauntlet. The saloons, general store, and even the small schoolhouse had become a series of interconnected strongholds, their windows reinforced and their doors braced. The sounds of daily life, the distant lowing of cattle, the ringing of the blacksmith's hammer, were now a backdrop to a more somber soundtrack, the metallic clicks of rifles being cleaned and reloaded, the low, steady rumble of men's voices as they rehearsed battle plans. Clay Callahan, who had once found solace in the solitude of the open range, now found himself at the center of a town he was sworn to protect. He moved with a newfound authority, his quiet presence a source of comfort to some and a symbol of dread to others. He spent his days drilling the townsfolk, a motley militia of ranchers, shopkeepers, and prospectors. He taught them to handle rifles they had only ever used for hunting, to build defensive positions from common household items, and to look out for one another. It was a difficult process. The baker, Mr. Abernathy, was an excellent shot but had a bad tremor from old age. The young ranch hand, Billy, was quick and agile, but his bravery often outweighed his caution. Clay was not just training them to be soldiers. He was forging a community, teaching them to rely on each other in ways they never had before. Ilara's schoolhouse had become the strategic heart of their defense. The books that had once been her most treasured possessions were now used as makeshift maps, their blank pages filled with hastily drawn sketches of the town and its defenses. Her knowledge of organization and her clear, legible handwriting made her an invaluable asset. She managed the inventory of their meager supplies, bullets, gunpowder, food, and water, and created a roster for the watch, ensuring no one was on duty for too long. Her days were a blur of planning and preparation, a constant, low-grade thrum of anxiety. But her nights were different. After the town had quieted, she and Clay would meet, finding a moment of stolen peace under the star-strewn sky. They spoke of things other than the coming fight, of their pasts, their hopes for a future that was increasingly uncertain, and the love that had bloomed so unexpectedly in the heart of this dusty, desperate town. Their bond, once a fragile and tentative thing, had become an unshakable anchor in the midst of the chaos. It was a quiet rebellion against the violence that threatened to consume them, a silent promise to each other that they would survive. But as the days bled into weeks, a new tension began to seep into the town. The initial unity began to fray. A few of the townsfolk, a grizzled prospector and a young mother, started questioning Clay's authority, whispering about the wisdom of defying a man like Rattler. "He's just bitin' them," the prospector grumbled one evening. "We should have just packed up and left. It's him they're really after." The words, though spoken in hushed tones, found their mark, sowing seeds of doubt and fear. The town, which had so recently been unified in its purpose, was now on the verge of fracturing. Clay, though he hid it well, felt the weight of their resentment. He was no longer just the town's savior. He was the reason for their suffering, the grim new reality of their lives. He knew that their survival depended on their unity, and that unity was slipping through his fingers like sand. Then, one evening, as the last light of day bled from the sky, a lone rider galloped into town, a cloud of dust billowing behind him. He was a scout Clay had sent out to patrol the outer reaches of the territory, and his face, usually grim, was now a mask of pure terror. He slid off his horse, his eyes wide and panicked, and stumbled toward Clay and Alara, who were standing watch at the old schoolhouse. He didn't need to say a word. The raw fear in his eyes was enough. He held out a piece of charred wood, its surface scarred by fire, and dropped it into Clay's hand. On the surface, the wood looked like nothing more than a burnt piece of debris, but on its underside, etched with a knife, was a familiar and chilling symbol. The coiled shape of a rattlesnake. They had left him a message. He was coming, and they were close. The scout took a shuddering breath. "They're ridin' fast, Clay. Headin' this way. And there's more of 'em than I ever seen. And they ain't alone." He gestured toward a dark, empty space on the plains, a place where a small, telltale plume of dust had just started to rise above the horizon. The quiet had ended. The waiting was over. The rattlesnake was at their door, and the war for Harmony Creek was finally about to begin. The plume of dust on the horizon grew quickly, morphing from a distant wisp into a thunderous, churning red wave. The scout's terrified whisper had been an understatement. It wasn't just Rattler's gang, it was a small army. Dozens of riders, their numbers swelled by other renegades and drifters drawn by the promise of easy plunder, rode toward Harmony Creek like a plague of locusts. The air filled with a muffled thunder of hooves, a sound that resonated deep in the bones of every man, woman, and child hiding behind the makeshift barricades. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and for the first time, a sense of hopeless resignation began to spread through the town like a slow poison.